The challenge announced. The galactic arena had stood for thousands of years as a monument to power and pride, a ring of stone and steel floating in the orbit of a dead star. It was said that no one who stepped onto its floor could hide their weakness. Here the greatest warriors from countless species had fought, and here reputations were destroyed or carved into legend. The galaxy respected the arena as a place of truth, for there was no diplomacy here, no words that could twist outcomes, only strength and survival. The reigning champion was a creature known as Vorak, the Colossus. A towering mass of scaled armor and raw muscle, Vorak had fought in the arena for 2 centuries, and not once had he fallen. His victories were so complete that crowds no longer came to see if he would win, but to see how quickly his opponent would be crushed. His name was spoken with awe and fear across the stars, for he was believed to be unmatched in strength. When the announcement came that a human had been chosen to challenge him, laughter swept through the galaxy. The smaller races mocked the decision. Even the proud warrior clans of the Dravani and Zirl were baffled. They had studied humans and found them to be frail compared to the armored titans of war across the stars. Their bones were weaker, their bodies smaller, their lifespans pitiful. In the minds of most aliens, humans were an afterthought, a curiosity, a mistake of biology, and certainly not warriors worthy of the arena. Yet, the challenge had been made, and the rules of the arena could not be broken. If a warrior stood and accepted, then the fight would take place. So it was that the announcement drew the largest crowd in centuries. Countless ships gathered in orbit there, crews eager to watch the humiliation unfold within the arena. The crowd roared for Vorak, confident that the fight would last no more than a single breath. They wanted blood. They wanted the human torn apart. The gates at one end of the arena opened, and Vorak stepped through. His massive form shimmered with scales like obsidian plates, each step shaking the ground. His forearms flexed like living weapons, and his roar echoed off the walls, shaking dust from the rafters. The crowd rose to their feet, chanting his name, certain of his triumph. Then the opposite gate opened and the human walked forward. He was not armored in massive plates or carrying an oversized weapon. Instead, he wore a simple combat suit of reinforced fabric, and at his side hung only a blade forged of steel. His figure looked small in the vast arena, his movements calm, steady. His eyes, however, burned with a fire that many in the stands could not understand. He did not tremble, nor bow, nor flinch. He simply walked to the center of the arena and stood ready. The laughter grew louder at the sight of him. Aliens jeered and mocked his fragile form. They could not see what lay beneath the skin. They could not understand the centuries of human struggle, the endless wars, the hunger, the survival against impossible odds. To them, he was a weakling about to die. To him, this was the moment to show the galaxy what it meant to be human. Vorak looked down at him, a grin splitting his monstrous face. The Colossus raised, his weapon a massive blade that had ended countless lives, and pointed it at the human warrior. The crowd howled with approval. They were certain that within moments this strange little challenger would be nothing more than another corpse in the sands of the arena, but the human did not move. He lifted his chin just slightly, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the arena like steel on stone. He said, "I accept your challenge, the human's preparation." Long before the human stepped into the arena, his journey had already begun on Earth. It was not strength of muscle or hardness of bone that had prepared him, but the history of his people. For millennia, humanity had been at war with itself, shaping warriors in fire and blood. Every empire, every nation, every tribe had known conflict, and each generation passed down lessons of survival, from the earliest days of stone and fire to the age of machines and stars. Humans were born into struggle and carried the marks of it in their spirits. His name was Elias Kane, a soldier once of the Earth Defense Forces and later chosen by the Council of Humanity to represent them when the challenge was announced. He had not been the tallest or the strongest of candidates, but he carried something in his eyes that the others did not, a cold determination that bent but did not break. The elders saw it and knew that in him was the spirit that had allowed humanity to rise from caves to command ships among the stars. In the weeks before the battle, Elias trained not only his body but his mind. He did not have the luxury of thinking like an alien warrior, for brute strength alone would mean death. He studied recordings of Vorak's battles. He watched every move the Colossus made, every weakness. However small, Elias trained his breathing to remain calm under pressure, his reflexes sharpened with endless drills, and his endurance tested until his body nearly collapsed. He knew that the fight would not be one of strength against strength, but of endurance against arrogance and patience against fury. On Earth, the people watched with both pride and fear. No human had ever stood in the arena before. If Elias failed, the galaxy would see them as weak, forever doomed to be treated as prey among predators. Children sent him messages of hope. Soldiers saluted his name and families prayed for his survival. He bore the weight of billions on his shoulders, but he did not let it crush him. Instead, he turned it into fuel, knowing that when he fought, he would not fight only for himself but for every man, woman, and child who called Earth home. As the day of the duel approached, the alien media broadcast endless commentary. Some mocked humanity, calling them fools for sending such a fragile warrior. Others dismissed Elias as an offering to buy peace through humiliation. But a few voices, quieter yet more thoughtful, began to wonder. What if humans were not as weak as they seemed? What if the arena revealed something hidden? Elias himself cared little for their words. In the final hours before his transport to the arena, he sat in silence. He remembered the deserts where soldiers marched with bleeding feet and no water. He remembered the frozen wastes where armies fought not only the enemy, but the cold and hunger. He remembered how humanity had endured plagues and storms and endless wars and yet survived every trial. When his breath came steady and his heart grew calm, he whispered to himself a simple promise. He would not fall easily. He would make the galaxy understand what it meant when a human stood and fought. When the doors of the transport finally opened and the arena loomed before him, he walked with steady steps, his heart beat slow, his mind clear. Behind him stood the history of his people. Before him stood the most feared warrior in the galaxy. He felt no fear, only a cold fire that burned in his chest, for he knew that the fight was not simply about survival. It was about the future of humanity. As he entered the arena, he did not look at the crowd nor at the jeering faces of alien spectators. He looked only at the sand beneath his boots and at the monstrous form of Vorak, waiting in the distance. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing left but the two of them. And in that moment, Elias Kane was no longer just a soldier. He was the will of humanity made flesh, walking into battle with nothing but his blade, his resolve, and the unshakable spirit of his kind. First clash in the arena. The air inside the arena was alive with noise. The roar of thousands of alien voices echoed across the stone walls and shook the very ground. The crowd had come for blood, and they expected to see it quickly. Vorak stood at one end of the field, his massive body glistening under the harsh light, his forearms flexing with confidence. Each of his movements radiated power and arrogance. He was a mountain of scales and muscle forged in endless combat, and he stared at Elias as though he were already dead. Elias stood opposite, his blade hanging loosely at his side. His stance was calm, his breath steady. While the crowd mocked him with laughter, he felt the weight of their eyes, but he did not waver. He had trained for this moment. He had prepared his body and mind for what was coming. He knew Vorak would come at him with full fury, eager to end the fight quickly and humiliate the human before the galaxy. So Elias waited for the storm to fall upon him. With a deafening roar, Vorak charged forward. Each step shook the arena floor, his weapon raised high like a thunderbolt, ready to crush Elias into the sand. The crowd screamed their approval, certain that the fight would end before it began. But at the last instant, Elias moved. He stepped aside with a speed that caught even the champion by surprise. The blade slammed into the ground where Elias had stood, sending sand and stone into the air. But the human was already moving, his body low, his eyes sharp. He countered with a strike aimed not at Vorak's chest, but at the joint of his armored leg. The blade bit into the scaled hide, and though it did not cut deep, it drew the first blood. The arena fell silent for a heartbeat. Shock rippled through the crowd. No one had ever seen Vorak bleed so soon in battle. The champion snarled, his yellow eyes burning with rage. He swung his second blade with terrifying force, but Elias ducked, rolling across the sand and rising to his feet without hesitation. Every move was calculated, every step measured. He could not match the alien's strength, so he would not try. Instead, he would let his endurance and speed carve opportunities where brute force could not. Vorak attacked again and again. His strikes were like falling towers, each one capable of crushing Elias in an instant. Yet the human dodged with precision sometimes, slipping under a swing, sometimes darting backward just far enough to avoid the blade. His body ached. His muscles burned, but he held on, letting instinct and training guide him. The crowd jeered, at first calling him a coward for refusing to stand and meet the blows head on. But slowly their voices shifted from laughter to disbelief. Elias saw the rhythm of Vorak's movements. He saw how the champion relied on overwhelming power, striking with arrogance, because no one had ever dared defy him. He began to exploit it, landing small cuts on the arms, on the joints, striking where the scales were weakest. The wounds were shallow, but they multiplied with each exchange. The crowd began to murmur uneasily. Their invincible champion was being marked by a warrior they had mocked as weak. Vorak grew furious. His roars echoed like thunder and his swings grew wilder. He wanted to crush the human quickly to remind the galaxy of his dominance. But the harder he struck, the more Elias adapted. He bent, with the strikes rolled with the impacts, and returned to his feet again and again. His calm unnerved the Colossus, and for the first time in centuries, Vorak felt something new. He felt doubt. The clash went on until sweat and blood mixed on the arena. Floor Elias stood breathing hard, his body bruised and his arm cut, yet his eyes still burned with fire. Vorak loomed above him, still powerful, still deadly, but no longer untouchable. The crowd could sense it too. What had begun as a spectacle of certain defeat had turned into something no one had expected. The galaxy's strongest warrior was fighting not a weakling but an opponent who refused to fall, and as Elias raised his blade once more, the silence of the crowd broke into chaos. Some shouted, in fear, some in anger, and some in awe. The first clash was over, but the battle had only just begun. The hidden strength of humanity. The air in the arena grew heavier with every passing moment. The laughter that had once rolled like thunder through the alien crowd was gone, replaced by whispers of disbelief and nervous muttering. They had come to watch a quick slaughter, yet the fragile human had not only survived, but had drawn blood from the invincible champion. Vorak himself could feel the sting of shame in every cut on his skin. The thought that a creature so small could leave marks upon him filled him with boiling rage. He roared and lunged forward, swinging both massive blades with such fury that the ground split where they struck. Elias barely escaped each attack, rolling, sliding, and springing back to his feet again. His lungs burned, his arms ached, his ribs throbbed where the edge of one blade had grazed him, but he refused to fall. He could hear his heart pounding like war, drums inside his chest, and every beat reminded him that this was the moment his people depended on. He remembered the deserts of Earth where men marched through storms of heat and still fought. He remembered the frozen mountains where soldiers bled into the snow yet pushed forward. He remembered the endless struggles of humanity, and he carried them all into the fight. Vorak pressed harder now, his attacks no longer precise but wild, driven by fury. The arrogance that had made him careless now twisted into anger that blinded him further. His movements grew heavier, slower, each swing carrying enough force to shatter walls yet leaving his body exposed. Elias saw it and seized his chance. He darted to the side and struck the back of Vorak's knee, the blade biting deep enough to send the giant staggering. The crowd gasped in unison. Never had they seen the champion stumble. Elias knew he could not match strength for strength, so he relied on what humanity had always mastered: adaptation. In every move he adjusted, learning from each strike. He endured every scrape and bruise. Every time Vorak changed his rhythm, Elias shifted his own. He was like water flowing around stone, always bending, never breaking, and every pass he made left another wound on the monster who was supposed to be unbreakable. Blood began to streak the sand, thick black blood that dripped from Vorak's wounds. His fury turned to disbelief. For the first time in centuries, he realized that victory was not certain. He roared again, his voice shaking the stands, and charged with reckless desperation. The blow came down like a falling star, and Elias met it with everything he had, raising his blade to deflect, then sliding beneath the strike. He drove his shoulder against the giant's chest and planted his sword deep into the exposed flesh of his side. The impact rattled his bones and pain shot through his arm, yet he did not release his grip until Vorak howled in agony. The arena was no longer filled with jeers but silence, broken only by the sound of battle aliens who had dismissed humanity as weak and unworthy, now stared in shock at the sight before them. The champion was bleeding, his massive form marred by the cuts of a warrior who should have been crushed within the first breath. The galaxy was beginning to see a truth it had ignored for too long. Humans were not built for brute strength, but for endurance, for cunning, and for the unyielding will to fight. When all reason said to fall, Elias stood panting, his blade dripping with black blood. His body trembled from exhaustion, yet his spirit burned brighter than ever. He stared up at Vorak, and for the first time the Colossus hesitated. His great chest rose and fell with labored breath, his arms heavy, his pride wounded. It was not the sight of a weapon that unsettled him, but the fire in the eyes of the human, a fire that spoke of battles fought through impossible odds and victories earned through sheer will. The arena crowd understood then that this fight was no longer a performance of strength but a revelation. The galaxy's strongest warrior was not only fighting a human, he was fighting the spirit of a species that had survived every trial their world had thrown at them, and that spirit was not one that surrendered. The turning point. The silence in the arena stretched like a great weight, pressing down upon the countless alien spectators. They had come to cheer for Vorak, to laugh at the human, and to revel in an easy slaughter. Instead, they were watching something none of them had imagined. The champion who had stood unchallenged for centuries was bleeding, his steps slower, his breath heavier. The human was battered and cut, yet still standing unbroken. And that truth unsettled the galaxy more than any blade could. Elias felt the ache of every strike that had landed upon him. His ribs screamed with pain, his vision blurred from the blood that ran into his eyes, and his arms trembled with exhaustion. Every breath he took was a battle of its own. Yet when he looked across the sands at the towering figure of Vorak, he did not think of surrender. He thought of Earth, of its long history carved in blood and fire. He thought of the endless wars where soldiers fought with broken bodies but refused to fall. He thought of the billions watching from their homes across the stars who needed to know that humanity could not be broken. Vorak roared again, trying to shake the doubt from his heart. His massive frame surged forward, blades spinning with deadly arcs. Each swing carried the strength of mountains crashing down, yet the strikes were slower than before. Elias slipped between them, his body moving with desperate speed. He ducked beneath one swing, felt the air of another rush past his face, and then he leapt forward, driving his blade across Vorak's arm. The cut was shallow, but the roar it drew showed that the wound stung deep. The crowd gasped aloud, for they were beginning to see what Vorak himself feared. The human was not fighting for victory alone, he was fighting to endure. Each strike the Colossus delivered cost him strength. Each missed blow drained him further. Elias was forcing the battle into a war of attrition, and humanity had always thrived in wars that tested endurance. Vorak's fury twisted into something darker. He slammed one foot into the ground and sent a shockwave through the sand. Elias staggered off balance, and in that instant the giant's blade struck his side. The impact hurled him across the arena, his body rolling until he lay motionless. The crowd erupted with savage cheers, certain the end had finally come. But slowly Elias pushed himself up, blood dripping from his lips. His body screamed at him to stay down, yet he rose one step at a time, his blade still clutched tight, his eyes blazing with unbroken fire. He did not speak, but his actions spoke louder than words to every soul watching. This fight was not finished, and he would not give. And Vorak stared at him, disbelief etched across his monstrous face. No warrior had ever risen after such a blow. He bared his fangs and thundered across the field, determined to end it once and for all. He struck again and again, but Elias met him, not with strength, but with resilience. His parries were weak, his body battered, but every movement carried. Precision, and every counter landed where it mattered most. Small cuts, shallow wounds, yet they added up with each desperate clash. The arena no longer roared with confidence. The voices that once mocked now shouted in awe or fear, for they were witnessing something greater than combat. They were seeing a truth about humanity that had been hidden from the stars, that when a human was pushed to the edge, they did not fall. They grew stronger. Elias staggered to his feet again and again, his blood staining the sand, yet his spirit never faltered. His eyes met Vorax, and in them the Colossus saw something he had never faced before, a will that refused to die, a fire that even the strongest blade could not extinguish. And in that moment, the galaxy realized that the turning point had come. The champion was no longer the hunter. The human had become the storm that would decide the fate of the arena. The defeat of the unbeatable. The arena shook with the sound of steel clashing and the roar of 1,000 voices, yet in the center of the storm stood only two figures. One a towering mountain of scaled flesh and fury, the other a battered human bleeding from a dozen wounds. But still on his feet, Vorax's breath came in ragged bursts, his arms heavy with exhaustion, every swing of his massive blade slower than the one before. Elias felt his body close to breaking, his legs shaking, his lungs burning, his vision fading at the edges. But he knew that if he collapsed now, humanity would be remembered as weak, and nothing more. Vorax roared and raised his weapon high, the air trembling with the force of his strength. He brought it down with a crash that would have shattered stone. But Elias stepped aside, his body moving on instinct, faster than thought. The blade slammed into the sand, throwing dust into the air, and in that moment of opening, Elias struck his sword, cut deep across Vorax's arm, tearing through scales and muscle. The Colossus bellowed in agony, staggering back, his blood spilling across the arena floor. The crowd gasped in disbelief, their voices trembling with fear, for they had never seen their champion falter. He had been called the undefeated, the eternal warrior, the symbol of strength across the galaxy. Yet here before them he was wounded, his pride and his flesh torn by the very being they had scorned. A human Elias felt the weight of every watching eye, and he pressed forward despite the pain that screamed through his body. Vorax swung again, but his movements were sluggish, his fury blinding him. Elias ducked beneath the strike and slashed across his side. Another roar, another step backward. The giant tried to grab him with his free hand, but Elias rolled away and stabbed at his leg, the blade biting into the joint and forcing the Colossus to stumble to one knee. The crowd fell silent as dust and blood filled the air, the sound of the mighty warrior crashing down echoing louder than any cheer. Vorax lifted his head, his eyes blazing with hatred and disbelief. He swung wildly, desperate to rise again, but Elias did not retreat. He stepped into the storm, his every strike guided not by strength, but by unyielding will. He cut across the other leg, across the chest, across the arms, until the champion could no longer keep his balance. With a final cry, Elias drove his blade deep into the ground before Vorax's throat, his stance unwavering though his body trembled. The arena exploded with chaos. Some screamed in anger, some in terror, and some in awe, but none could deny what they had witnessed. The undefeatable warrior of the galaxy, the symbol of power who had ruled for centuries, lay beaten, his body broken, his pride shattered. A human had done the impossible. Vorax's head lowered, his great body collapsing into the dust. His voice rumbled weakly. "You are no warrior of flesh. You are something more." Elias looked down at him, his chest heaving, his blood soaking the sand, but his eyes still bright. He spoke so that the entire arena could hear. Humanity has always been something more because we never stop fighting. The silence that followed was heavier than any roar. The crowd looked at Elias not with scorn, but with fear and awe. The unbeatable had been defeated not by greater strength, but by the endurance and will of a human. And in that moment the galaxy understood that the age of mocking humanity was over. Humanity's new reputation. The arena was filled with a silence that carried more weight than any roar. The greatest warrior the galaxy had ever known lay beaten in the dust, his body scarred and his spirit broken. The impossible had been witnessed by thousands in the stands and by billions watching across the stars. A human had stood against the strongest warrior and triumphed. The laughter that had mocked humanity only hours ago was gone, replaced with a fear that spread from seat to seat and from world to world. Elias. Cain stood in the center of the field, his body broken, his wounds bleeding freely, his breath shallow but his eyes never wavering. He leaned upon his blade, not as a crutch but as a banner planted into the sands of the arena. His victory was not his alone. It was the victory of every human who had been called weak, who had been dismissed as fragile. It was the victory of a species that had always endured storms, wars, and despair and emerged stronger. The announcers who had mocked him in the beginning now struggled to speak, their voices trembling as they declared the unthinkable. Elias. Cain, the human challenger, was the new champion of the arena. The words rolled like thunder across the stands, and for the first time in centuries, Vorak was no longer the name chanted by the galaxy. Instead, the whispers began. Humanity. 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 On Earth, the celebration shook cities and villages alike. Families wept and soldiers raised their fists to the sky. Children looked at the stars with new eyes, for now they knew that their people were no longer the forgotten newcomers. Humanity had proven itself not through domination but through resilience and courage. The weight of humiliation that might have followed defeat was instead transformed into a crown of pride. In the chambers of alien councils, fear spread quickly. The Dravani lords, who had once spoken of enslaving humans, now held private meetings in secret, wondering if humanity might one day rise against them. The Ziril clans, who had laughed at the challenge, sent word to their fleets to keep their distance from Earth. Even the ancient powers of the galaxy, who had believed themselves beyond question, whispered of what might come if humanity were provoked. For they had all seen the same truth that Elias had forced into the light. Humans did not stop fighting. Vorak was carried away from the field, his massive form broken. Yet even in his defeat he muttered words that would haunt the galaxy. He had said that humans were not warriors of flesh, but something greater, something unyielding. Elias himself said nothing more after the battle. He raised his blade once to the crowd and then lowered it in a gesture of finality. The fight was over, and the message was clear. Humanity would never be dismissed again. As Elias left the arena, his steps slow but steady, the galaxy watched in silence, some with admiration, some with fear, all with respect. The legend of Vorak had ended, but the legend of humanity had just begun. The story would be told across countless worlds that the smallest warrior had defeated the greatest titan, not with overwhelming strength but with an unbreakable will. And in that story every alien would learn the same lesson. Humanity was not to be underestimated. The arena stood quiet long after the crowd dispersed, as if it too understood the weight of what had happened. The sand, still stained with the blood of the unbeatable champion, would forever remind those who walked its grounds of the day a human rewrote the order of power in the galaxy. From that day forward, no warrior, no council, and no empire would ever speak of humanity as weak again, for they had seen with their own eyes what it meant when a human chose to fight. And so the story closed with Elias Cain returning to his people, scarred, yet unbowed, carrying with him not only his victory but the respect of the galaxy. He had walked into the arena alone, but he had left carrying the strength of an entire species. The message echoed across the stars. Humanity never yields. Humanity never breaks. Humanity fights until the last breath and beyond. The legacy of the human warrior. When Elias Cain returned from the arena, he carried not only the scars of battle, but the weight of a new destiny for his people. Across the galaxy, whispers spread faster than fleets. The name of Vorak the Undefeated was spoken with disbelief, for he had fallen, and the hand that struck him down was human. No longer could the alien races look upon Earth as a place of weakness or fragility. Humanity had shown its true strength, and it was not measured in muscle or armor but in the spirit that refused to fall. Elias stood before the leaders of Earth, his armor torn, his blade stained, yet his voice steady. He did not claim the glory for himself. He said the victory belonged to every child who had grown strong in hardship, to every mother who had carried her family through hunger. To every soldier who had marched into hopeless battles and kept walking, he said the arena had not seen a man. It had seen the heart of all humanity, and the galaxy would never forget it. In distant halls of power, alien rulers argued over how to treat Earth. Some called for caution, others for alliance, and some for fear. But none any longer dared to call humanity weak soldiers who once mocked humans, now studied their ways, seeking to understand how a fragile body could endure where giants had fallen. Scholars wrote of them as Death World survivors, and their words carried a new respect. And in secret, the younger races looked to humanity with hope, believing that if humans could rise against the impossible, then so could they. Elias himself disappeared from the spotlight. He returned to the quiet of his home, his blade laid to rest in the halls of Earth's defenders. Yet even in silence, his legend grew tales of the man who stood before the galaxy's strongest, and did not fall spread from one star system to another until his name became more than human. It became a promise that when humanity stood together, no force could break them. Generations would pass, and still the memory of that day in the arena would burn. Bright children would grow up hearing how a human faced the Colossus and forced the galaxy to kneel to respect. The arena itself would carry his name etched into its stones, and every warrior who stepped into that circle would remember that once a man from Earth showed the stars that courage and will were weapons greater than any blade. Thus, the story of Elias Kane was not only about a single battle, it was the beginning of a new age for humanity. The galaxy learned fear and awe that day, and Earth learned pride. Humanity had stepped out from the shadow of doubt and into the light of destiny, and no race could ever erase what had been seen in the sands of the arena, and so it was remembered, the human who would not yield, the warrior who fought beyond strength, the spirit of Earth that burned brighter than stars. The end.